Well, hello again. It's David Willey here on what started off as actually rather a lovely summer's day, and it now sort of clouded over a little bit. And I've got Finn here with me as well to keep me company and to keep me busy as well. I want to talk to you today about something that, well, it's actually this little object I've got here, which more of that in a moment. But I want to start by, and forgive me if I ramble a bit because, well, there we are, I said I waffle. But I want to sort of bring a number of different topics here and hopefully bring them together slightly. I want to talk a little bit, first of all, about the power of the object. Now, coming from a museum, I'm deeply conscious that one of the USPs of museums is exactly that, this idea that we have items that have stories. Sometimes it's because of their value, their rarity, where they were, what they were engaged in. People, you know, all sorts of things can give that object a certain sort of power. And I used to see it all the time. You know, people walk around the corner, there's that tiger tank, and you could see the look, whether it's dad, son, rest of the family. You know, the awe-inspiring nature of its sheer size. The fact that someone might have made a model of it, well, the fact in one sense we're familiar with, but here it is in reality, or I still didn't quite realise it was that big. All those amazing things that can come with the real thing. But I also wanted to point out that power of an object is all around us all the time. And knowing most of this audience there, a lot of the people watching this, probably blokes of a certain age, some of you are collectors, but even if you're not, just think about what's around your home, your room, where you are, etc. And there's things we've all got that we can understand what that phrase, the power of an object, means. Because to me, sometimes it can be something big, some things it's very modest, which I'll talk about in a moment, very small item, but it's the way that certain things. And this is where the language gets a bit awkward, because how can that item be imbued with a story or history? And yet it is. It's so obvious. Think in your own house, you know, think of if you're a bloke, you go to the garage. There's tools in the garage or in your workshop that belong to dad. And you might not use them that much or whatever, but you ain't going to throw them in the bin, are you? Because you might have remembered when dad was using that, or something, a project you might have been going to do together. Go in the kitchen. I bet every household in the kitchen drawer somewhere, there's a few of those items, a carving knife, something or other that's come down, I say through the family, as if you've got some great long tradition here. You don't have to be. It could just be mums, granddads, grandmas, you know, something that they used to use all the time that to you is familiar. It reminds you of them. It takes you back. Maybe you did use it with them many, many years ago, etc. And to me, these are all those things that therefore that object is imbued with a history and connotations and an emotion and all sorts of things that's very special, adding up to that idea of the power of the object. And of course, so many of those objects, if you can imagine you were doing what I'm doing now, sitting down talking to the camera, with however mundane that item is in the hand, what it brings back for you, the person who used it, the time you used it in, you'll start seeing that all these things have got so many different leads into that item, and whether it can tell you about a moment in history, about an event, about fashion, about technology, about all those different things, you know, that's the thing. So I'm saying all that because I'm sure most of you realise this all the time, and if you visit or you collect or whatever, you know. But to me, sometimes as well, there's this idea that you know an item that you come across, if you do the charity shop, you know, that situation, some items ended up there. Where's it come from? Is it the person's died and the family's cleared out, whatever's happened that way? And some of that story is lost, but somehow you know that item is still imbued with something there. And wouldn't it be nice to know all these things? And for me, someone passed on this small object, which they were doing their house clearance, family member gone into shelter of accommodation, I think, house clearance, etc., etc. They knew it wasn't actually to do with them, but perhaps a previous generation before. But it's a small case, and I can only describe it as, if you're looking at this, I think it's too small to be actually a cigarette case, or they were very small cigarettes if they were smoking cigarettes at that time. But it dates back to, I think, around the time of the First World War. And there's a nice saucy lady showing her assets on the front here. It's mocked up tortoiseshell on a fairly, cheap produced, no doubt, souvenir type item. But that alone is, okay, it has a charm to it. But what's inside it makes it something, for me, a little bit more special. And it goes into this, again, how objects can reveal the history, but also it's what that history was like and what it was saying. So again, as you look inside this, spray painted inner there, little clip, mock tortoiseshell back, and it's obviously seen the wear of time. It's a little bit tatty and damaged and everything. But inside is this piece of paper, which I'll let you see and zoom in on. But it's a piece of paper that says it's Lord Kitchener's instructions. Now, this piece of paper, if you go back to the First World War, what happens is Britain declares war on August the 4th. Kitchener is made Minister of War. Kitchener, the famous guy in all the wonderful posters with his moustache. Kitchener's is a national hero already, and he has enormous influence in Britain at the time. The politicians find, he's quite hard to, they all talk about the fact it's hard sometimes when they're in meeting with him to meet his eye. Well, actually, he's got a cast in one of his eyes, but they find this a tricky one because he's such a name and has got such a background with him. But Kitchener's also one of the first to see that this is not going to be a short war. He's immediately saying 3 years, probably at least, and we're going to need to get a 1 million men army going straight away. And of course, don't forget, war's going to be over by Christmas, as popular thoughts are, etc. So, you can read Kitchener's, again, amazing life story, amazing things he did around the world, in Egypt and Far East, all sorts of things he gets up to. But anyway, the point about Kitchener I want to say here is, again, he's high church. His secretary, Sir George Arthur, is quite high church as well. He gets George Arthur to write a small note that he wants all the soldiers to take with him. They're going to be issued with this. And the BEF is ready, amazing feat of logistics and getting people at the right place, right time. 9th of August, okay, under a week, and the British Army, the British Expeditionary Force, is heading over to France. And they are given a rousing address that's been presented for them by the king. And they're also given this, and they're told this is to be kept as a confidential document in your pay book. And what it's basically saying is, in that beautiful euphemistic language of the time, lines such as, remember that the honour of the British Army depends upon your individual conduct. It will be your duty not only to set an example of discipline, but also to maintain friendly relations with those you are helping in this struggle. And it goes on, you're in a friendly country. You can do your country no better service than in showing yourself in France and Belgium in the true character of the British soldier. Be invariably courteous, considerate and kind. Never do anything likely to destroy property. Always look upon looting as a disgraceful act. You are sure to meet with welcome and be trusted. Your conduct must justify that welcome and that trust. Your duty cannot be done unless you are healthy and sound. So keep constantly on your guard against any excesses. With this new experience, you may find temptation in both wine and in women. You must entirely resist both temptations, and whilst treating all women with perfect courtesy, you should avoid any intimacy. Do your duty bravely, fear God, honour the King. Now that wonderful period piece, as we probably think about it today, was issued to every soldier before they set off. And as I said, they were supposed to keep it in their pay book. And again, that draws us into that moment, that time, because Kitchener's very much, well, the British Army's had a long history of that issue of what do we do with all these young, fit young lads, cusp of their life, etc. They're bound to have an interest in, one assumes, the opposite sex most of the time there. And this idea that they're going out there, they're going to be tempted. But at the same time, the army, again, has had this peculiar, most of the late 19th century, this sort of an attitude of, we know it's going to happen, but we're not going to say anything officially about it. So whether it was monitoring brothels, red light districts, things that along those sorts of lines. And if anything came in the press, then the army could say, well, we knew nothing of this officially, etc. But they knew it was going to happen. And that's one of those sort of tricky histories that's always out there. And if you get interested in that history, to do with the First World War, yeah, I know, Finn. You don't have an opinion on it. Put this back carefully at the moment. Let me put that down there. There's a number of sources you can go to, because it is quite, you know, it's another one of those histories that's always there, and it appears sometimes in letters and memoirs, but inevitably it's not ever, especially because of, depending on the period you're talking about, dwelt on that much. So one of the books I'd recommend if you do get interested, Bruce Cherry, They Didn't Want to Diverge in Sex and Morale on the British Army on the Western Front, talks about it in that period. And this idea, why I go back to this particular object, why I just think it's fascinating is to me that idea of there's the souvenir, the Parisian, you know, when the British Army was going over to France, it was that idea of wine, women, song, gay Paris. It was still all that sense that France was slightly saucier, etc. And again, you know, the backgrounds of all these guys, most of the BF in 1914 were the old sweats, the old contemptibles as they became known. Many of these guys had served around the world, etc. before. The next armies, ironically called the Kitchener's armies, that will be going out, that will be being formed later, much more cross-section of society, much more, you know, and again, that diversity of their backgrounds, their education, their experiences, but still the vast majority, relatively young men, still on the cusp of their lives, as I say, going to be interested in the opposite sex and what comes with that. So when you read about these things, you sort of, you know, as I was saying, that they weave through the some of the memoirs, etc. And inevitably, when in France, people bought the old idea of the saucy postcard or things like that little book, that little container I just showed you. And the fact that for me, the irony in that object, that somebody has ended up putting Kitchener's address of basically restraint and, you know, do the decent thing, don't worry about this sort of other ladies and such like, or wine, women, song, in such a lovely little object. So look at the irony there, the source or the up yours type answer that might be interpreted in that object. And I also, because we're on this subject, I always thought, because again, there's all the different stories about what happened to who, where in the memoirs, references quite often in the period to things going on. But I thought, I just read this one because some of you will have heard of Vera Britain and Testament of Youth. But people, obviously, they had boyfriends and girlfriends back home. They have exchanges of letters. There's all the married soldiers. But one thing, because a completely separate incident, we bumped into seeing some of this, was where sometimes people would write a letter and there'd be some intimate details in the letter. But to the, I don't know, I was going to say pleasure, but to the sort of, you know, encouragement, what's the word that you could find here? Sometimes people would read those letters out to the rest of the group, you know, to give them that sense of intimacy, of home, of other things and everything. And Vera Britain, there's a quote here. So she wrote Testament of Youth. And it says here, she confides to her diary, quote, "I have never thought I should be able to say to anyone such things as I write to Roland, that's her boyfriend then serving. I suppose the nearness of death breaks down the reserves and conventions which are seen to matter so little in the light of elemental things. So even someone like Vera Britain, very middle class, very, very well educated, etc., she's putting things in letters to her boyfriend, Roland, out in France, that are going to sort of, that are much more intimate than they would have ever normally written. And there's that idea as well. So, there's the interest in the salacious, in the postcards, saucy postcards. There's everything, just as the young man's fancy type thing. But there's also another side to it, because they realise, as is put in here, this title, they didn't want to die virgins. These are young soldiers that are facing potential death at any time soon. And therefore, that tendency to want to drink deeper of life quicker, because we might not have that amount of time. And that was also put beautifully in, it was kind of like a prose or rhyming novel, verse novel it was called, by someone called Alice Stewart Miller, who was an American lady in the Second World War. And she says it rather well, this idea of that sense of urgency. Lovers in peacetime with 50 years to live have time to tease and quarrel and question what to give. But lovers in wartime better understand the fullness of living with death close at hand. And again, that's another one of those things there. So things such as this, obviously my thoughts are this guy survives the war, because this comes back and probably only them as a person is going to see that lovely irony and relevance of hidden away, saucy cover, there's Kitchener, make sure you're living the clean life there. Normally that type of stuff was anything that was found. And I give an example here from Her Private's We by Frederick Manning, who served in the First World War. Wonderful novel of the experiences there. And he says about a colleague who's been killed, I took his pay book and some letters out of his tunic, but I left his identity disc for them as finds him. If our chaps hang on to what we got, there'll be some burying parties out. There's his pack, next mind. I suppose I'd better, and them letters, hand them in at the orderly room. There were a couple of smutty French photographs which I tore up. He were a decent enough lad, but boys are curious about such things. Don't mean no harm, but think 'em funny. 'Tis all in human nature, and I'll write a letter to his mother. Swales is decent folk, farming a bit of land, and I'm only a labouring man, but they always treated me fair when I worked for 'em. So most of that stuff, of course, then is not saved. It doesn't come back. It's not put in the letters home, and it's destroyed. But it's part of a life. If you see some of the photographs of the dugouts, etc., at the time, there's those Raphael Kirchner slightly saucy nudes on the walls, etc. Not things that will necessarily be saved in the same way as the signage from a trench might have been for years later. So a small object, as I mentioned, the power of that object to me is look at what a small thing can reveal, and those strands, the BF 1940, Kitchener's attitude to his army, please behave when you get out there, you're going to France, they're our allies, don't let the side down. The souvenir that someone's obviously bought, married those two things together, and it slipped through history. And thank you to the people who just passed it on to me, because that idea of where you find some of these things, they can't go in the bin, can they? And I finish with just that little moment, because again, we've talked about other topics and things, and I've seen some of the wonderful things people have put in terms of quotes, etc., about their jacket, they're this, they've still got, they wore, or something when I was talking about camouflage. But if there's, I think we'd all think that none of those things matter that much, is in the wider world's not going to be interested in it. But who ends up with that jacket you've got? Is it not worth just putting on a piece of paper, this belonged to, I wore it at, between those dates? Or if there is an item that you've got something that's, you know, got a story with that way. And however, just remember, other people are going to find interest in stories you might not think are, you know, top drawer stuff. why not try and record that in a manner that maybe one day someone else going through that jacket that you value now in a way understands some of its history and its importance, and that story that can come out with some of the mundane things, but it isn't amazing. And sometimes those are the things that trigger our interests, trigger that moment in history when we walk past. So I'll leave that one to you. Thanks very much. Right, what have we lost? Go on then.